Hi, welcome back to A Moment with Marta. So, this week I want to talk about the difference between tantrums and meltdowns. A lot of times I hear people use those words synonymously, and they are completely different things. They're two emotional outbursts, but they're totally different. So, a tantrum, you think about a tantrum when there's a 2-year-old, say, that is wanting something in a store or wanting something in particular to eat or wanting maybe their parents' attention. When they're not getting what they want, they cry, scream, have an emotional outburst of some sort. However, it usually stops when they either get what they want, or maybe if the parent gives them attention, they look to see if the parent is watching, then they might continue it some more to see if they'll get whatever it is that they're after. So a tantrum is an emotional outburst with a purpose. A meltdown is completely different. So in my previous video, we talked about sensory overload. So a meltdown happens when the input that a person on the autism spectrum is receiving from their environment, whether it's they are at the mall shopping, or they're eating at a restaurant, outside at a park, even if they're home but they're having to think or make choices, or whatever the circumstances may be, it could evoke an emotional outburst such as a meltdown, in which there is just simply too much sensory input to process. So a great analogy is thinking about a bottle of soda, Coke, let's say. And so you have a child on the spectrum that's going about their day. Maybe they have to decide what clothes they need to wear. So you shake that bottle. Maybe then they get stressed about some of the demands that are placed on them at school. You shake that bottle. They get overwhelmed by the noise in the cafeteria. You shake that bottle. Maybe there's just too much to think about with homework after school. Shake that bottle. At some point, you open that top and everything comes spewing out. So with a meltdown, it is an emotional outburst that is beyond the person's control. It's not something that they can stop. Usually it ends one of two ways. They either wear themselves out, and I have had kiddos have meltdowns for a couple of hours or more. So they either wear themselves out, or you're able to help them de-escalate by removing them from the environment that is causing them to have so much sensory overload. So an example of this is when my son was about 1, I was taking him to a mom and me dance class, and the first week we went was really fun. He had a great time. So I took him back the next week, and he just kept screaming. And at that point, I didn't know he had autism, but I remember distinctly he just kept screaming and crying. And so I finally was like, okay, well, he just clearly isn't into this today. We left the room. As soon as we left the room, he calmed down. He was okay. The difference was between week 1 and week 2, there were more people. And in that particular environment, it was overwhelming for him. It was too much noise. It was too much visual effects, and it was overstimulating for him. So he ended up having a meltdown. Another time, I remember taking my kiddos to the library, and it was one of those free events, but you have to get tickets in order to get in. And so we got there early. We were able to get a ticket, and we went inside, and it was pretty packed. It was a favorite event at that library, and my son was having a hard time coping and handling it. And he got to the point where he started crying and he couldn't stop. It was uncontrollable. And so I gave the ticket to the lady, said, okay, give it to whoever is next, because they had a limited number and there were plenty of people that were waiting. And we left. And as soon as we left, my son was able to calm down. So what's important about understanding the difference is that there's different ways to handle it. So if you have a child, let's say, having a tantrum because you are showing attention to their sibling, you can address what they want, saying, I know that you want my attention. I am talking with your sister, and I will talk with you afterwards. So you're validating what it is that they want, and you're giving them on your terms what you're going to give them and what they're hoping for. You're going to give them the attention, but it's going to be on your terms. You're not giving it to the tantrum. With a meltdown, you have to try to de-escalate it by removing them from the environment in which they're completely overwhelmed. Or if it's a case where you're an individual on the spectrum, that's what you have to do. I myself get really overwhelmed in crowds. I do not go Christmas shopping at Christmas time. I either do it really early or I order things online because I can't handle the crowds. I feel like everything's closing in on me. It's too much. And basically the feeling is you kind of start to get tunnel vision and things, the world is closing in on you, and you get so anxious and you have that sensory overload that you have either your flight or fight instinct. And so, I mean, it's our natural animalistic instinct to help us survive. And that's what happens when an individual goes into a meltdown. They go to that natural fight or flight mode where they're either going to defend themselves or they're going to try to flee to get away from that overload. And so the best thing as a caregiver, as a teacher, as a therapist is to be able to remove them from that stimuli. Say that they're getting super overwhelmed at a store. Maybe there's too many choices of clothes, maybe there's too many people, maybe it's too loud. There could be any number of things, or maybe it's all of the above. But what you could do is remove them from that room, or maybe go outside to the car, give them some time to decompress, give them a few minutes to breathe. Sometimes with my son, I would just take him outside for a little bit. Outside, the sound isn't so trapped. It doesn't bounce off things like it does inside, where it bounces off the walls. So things just feel more open. You don't feel so confined. Sound, it doesn't hurt your ears as much because it has farther to travel. So those were some things that I would do to help him. For myself and my daughter, at times we use those noise canceling headphones that I talked about as a way to help muffle some of that sound and some of that stimuli. So you can utilize some of those tools that I talked about in the previous video. But those are the major takeaways. There's a big difference between a tantrum and a meltdown. They do not mean the same thing. A child that has a purpose is having a tantrum. A child that is overstimulated by their environment and has sensory overload can go into a meltdown. And so those are the differences, and those are some strategies on how you can help either case. You want to look at, of course, functions of behaviors, and so you can judge accordingly how to handle when it's a tantrum. But for meltdowns, one of the best things you can do is just help to eliminate some of or all of the stimuli that is causing that kind of a reaction. And the Coke analogy is a great one, because that's exactly what it feels like. It feels like, okay, you're coping with this. Okay, you're coping with that. Okay, you're coping with this. And at some point, there's a straw that breaks the camel's back. You can't cope anymore, and it just all comes rushing out, and you have no control over it. So you just have to have a safe place where you can go to decompress. And different techniques work for different people. So anyway, thanks for tuning in to A Moment with Marta. Talk to you next time.